What if you had a guide who could tell you how to bridge a gap between who you are today and who you're destined to be? What if each week you could hear a story of someone who has tried and succeeded, or perhaps tried and failed, but learned something in the process? Limitless Spirit is a weekly podcast where host Helen Todd interviews guests about topics and personal stories on defining life's purpose, pursuing personal growth, and developing a deeper faith in Christ.
Going to Israel on one trip is worth at least a semester in Bible college or seminary because when you read the Bible, we skip over people names and place names because they don't mean much to us, or we substitute our own understanding of what we think it must be like. And then you get there and you realize it's totally different. And I call them the aha moments when people suddenly get it. They recognize, wow, that makes perfect sense. Everything fits into that context. And the Bible opens up in a new way. And then when they come back, they just keep experiencing that over and over again.
Why visiting Israel is an absolute must for every Christian? Well, for some people, the answer may seem obvious. For others, there are many reasons why the idea of visiting Israel seems scary or difficult or perhaps even overrated. Welcome to the Limitless Spirit podcast. I'm your host, Helen Todd. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Charles Dyer, a professor at large of Moody Bible Institute in Chicago and co-host of the Land of the Book radio program. He's considered an expert Bible scholar on Israel and the Middle East, and in 40 years, he has led over 100 trips to Israel. He is also a prolific author, and his most recent book is called Experiencing the Land of the Book, a life-changing journey through Israel. So in our conversation, we talk about what is Christmas like in Israel, discuss the return of Christ to Israel, and share some of our favorite stories from the past trips. I hope you enjoy this episode of the Limitless Spirit podcast. Hello, Dr. Dyer. Welcome to the Limitless Spirit podcast. How are you today?
Well, thank you. I'm doing great today, and I trust you are as well.
Yes, I am. It's such a beautiful week as we're preparing to celebrate a very important holiday for those who follow Jesus. So I felt like our conversation is very fitting for the season.
Yeah, appropriate to the time, right? Yes.
Yes. Well, you are considered an expert, and from what I heard, the best tour guide in Israel. And so you recently finished your book, Experiencing the Land of the Book, a life-changing journey through Israel. So if you don't mind, we are going to give our listeners an experience of being in Israel, even if they have not been to Israel, or maybe they have, but you obviously know some things that perhaps a common visitor wouldn't. So we will talk a little bit about Jesus's land, where he was born, where he lived, where he ministered, and where he's returning one day. So let's talk about Christmas. I know that Christmas is not a holiday, obviously, in Israel. And if one were to travel to Israel during that time, what would they experience?
Well, if they're in Israel proper, they would, in fact, a lot of Jewish people do this. They go to Nazareth because Nazareth is in Israel, but it's definitely a place where Christmas is celebrated, especially among the Christian population that's there. They would see things that would look very familiar to us, from Santa Claus to Christmas trees decorated. The one thing that may be slightly different than what we would expect in America, we tend to be on the Western calendar, whether the Roman Catholic or Protestant. December 25 is Christmas. Over there, they have a lot of Eastern Orthodox. So they celebrate December 25.
January 7th.
That's right. They also have the January celebration. And so it extends a little bit longer than we might expect. On the Palestinian side, you can go to Bethlehem. And of course, Christmas is a major celebration there because they're based on tourism and they're looking to get all the tourists they can in. But same kind of thing. In fact, it's a little bit surprising to go to the Church of the Nativity and maybe spot Santa Claus outside or see a Christmas tree and then Christmas decorations celebrated there. uh, geared more for us from the West, but they are definitely into celebrating Christmas. From the Boy Scouts, they have bands, they have marches, and just quite a big celebration. Some years bigger than others. This year, it looks like they're going to be having a good celebration on Christmas.
So I find this interesting, due to the commercial nature of Christmas holiday in the recent years. It seems like the whole world is participating in this celebration now, for maybe not the same reasons as a Christian would, but it's regardless, for whatever reason they commemorate this day, and inadvertently they commemorate the birth of Christ coming as a baby. So you said Jewish people would travel to Nazareth on that day. Is it just so that they celebrate a holiday, or is there any recognition of what they're celebrating?
For the most part, they're celebrating the holiday. They like the festivity, the activity. Probably the best I can picture here is it'd be like someone traveling to New York City in our country. They'd like to see the glitz and the glamour and the glitter of it all, even if they don't necessarily connect spiritually to what it really means. Now, the good thing is, and I'll pick Nazareth. There are Israeli Arab believers who are there, and Jewish believers in that area who do use it as an opportunity to try and reach out to Jewish and Arabs and help them understand the greater meaning of the season.
So if a Christian traveled to Israel on holiday and they wanted to truly experience the real Christmas story, what would you suggest? What kind of route would you suggest?
This sounds kind of funny. I would say they go to Nazareth, but go to Nazareth Village, which is run by the YMCA. It's actually trying to show what Nazareth would have been like in the first century. That could help take them back in time to understand what it would have been like when Jesus was born and when he lived. But I would also suggest visiting some of the Messianic congregations and some of the Arab Christian congregations and seeing how they celebrate the holiday. It's amazing. They'll sing the same songs. You may not know the lyrics in Arabic or in Hebrew, but you'll understand the tune. And just fellowshipping reminds us that heaven's going to be composed of people from every people and language and nation and tongue. And when you're around them, it really provides a special insight into what it's like and recognizing the things that we hold in common, even though we have a lot of cultural and language differences.
I agree. Our ministry works very closely with some of the evangelical congregation, Jewish, not Arab congregations in Israel, and one thing I've noticed is that their familiarity with the culture and perhaps even with the language gives them so much deeper insight sometimes on the scriptures, which to Western mindset maybe don't always make sense. So you've been traveling to Israel for 40 years and you've been taking groups. I can imagine that a lot has changed in these last 40 years. What are some of the changes that you have noticed?
Well, let me say it this way. On the positive side, tourism has grown. It's matured. There are sites that weren't even available before that now are easy. In fact, they're in many cases handicapped accessible, where before it was very, very strenuous to even get to some of the sites. The roads are better. You get to see more. Now, on the negative side, it's also more crowded. They have probably had about a 500% increase in tourism over that time. And traffic's increased dramatically to get to the sites. In fact, in Jerusalem, it's rather difficult to schedule visiting the sites, just trying to get your group around with all of the traffic that's there. But all in all, it really is an amazing place. I love going back. Every time I'm there, there's something new to see.
So I agree with you. The crowds is something that is, for me personally, is difficult to overcome because I do not like crowds. And my dream would be one day to visit Israel when there is no crowds. Of course, we had that opportunity during COVID, but then we couldn't travel to Israel during that time either. So still didn't get to experience that. But sometimes people feel, especially people who have not been to Israel, they feel like, oh, this is just hype. It's all tourist industry. It's overrated. Is it real? And it's quite expensive to travel to Israel and through Israel. So is it really worth it?
Well, what I tell students is that going to, and I taught on the Bible college and seminary level for years, going to Israel on one trip is worth at least a semester in Bible college or seminary. Because when you read the Bible, we skip over people names and place names because they don't mean much to us, or we substitute our own understanding of what we think it must be like. And then you get there and you realize it's totally different. And I call them the aha moments when people suddenly get it. They recognize, wow, that makes perfect sense. Everything fits into that context, and the Bible opens up in a new way. And then when they come back, they just keep experiencing that over and over again. If I can go back, you mentioned about going when it's a quiet time. It was a little over a year ago in June, right when they temporarily opened for COVID. I was there, and it was our small group and no one else in Israel. Selfishly, that was the best trip I've ever done because we had everything to ourselves and never had to fight the crowds. But it wasn't a great thing for Israel because they were hurting financially because of it. But yeah, it was an amazing experience.
So you just said that names and places make a lot more sense when you actually visit the land. Let's give me some examples.
Yeah, in fact, a couple of the ones from my very first trip. We went to Gideon's Spring, where he chose his 300 men. Well, I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania, and I envisioned that happening at the Susquehanna River, which near where I grew up was about a quarter mile wide. And then I stood there and recognized if I ran fast enough, I could jump over En Harod, the spring of Harod, where Gideon was. And you can't move the spring and you can't move the mountain. It's the exact spot. And suddenly that made perfect sense. Another one, we did a little sidewalk where Jonathan and his armor bearer routed the entire Philistine army. And I would always say to people, I believe it. It's in the Bible. But how can two people rout a whole army? And then we hiked it. And I recognized that the Philistine army didn't know there were only two of them as they climbed up the cliff. And you're there and go, this makes perfect sense. They send people over to stop them. They all get killed. And finally, the commander sends a group back to the main force and says, the Israelites are attacking and they're coming from this direction where we're not protected. And it panicked the whole Philistine army. It was little details like that I said, now I understand it because I could see where it happened in that actual context.
That's very true. But, with a lot of sites that you visit in Israel, there is more than one site that claims that it actually happened there. And, and there are many others where people say, well, I believe, and it depends on which tour guide you get. They have their own theories and privy to different archaeological findings. So how would you recommend a person dealing with that?
Well, I approach it two ways. As a teacher, there are places like the Upper Room would be one example, or where Calvary would be another example. And I want people to understand there are two possibilities. Here's why some hold one, why some hold another. And if I have an opinion, I'll say, and here's why I think this might be the better site. But I want them to understand that even if there's a debate on a few places, it doesn't change our faith. The second thing I do is use a little bit of humor. It is interesting in a few places when if you help people just understand why there are differences of opinion and the human foibles that come with it. And in many cases, it might be that the guide holds one place because he has a cousin who has a friend who has a shop right there, and basically he likes that site because he likes to shop at that shop. But a little bit of humor gives him a perspective. But what I really like is that 95% of the time, you can say to someone, we're in the right area. Whether it happened here or it happened 50 feet down the street, we don't know, but we know we're in the right area. and you can paint a picture from that spot where they can envision it in their own mind and go away with that understanding.
One of the examples also is the place of Jesus's crucifixion and burial. So we have the garden tomb and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So what is your opinion? I'm just curious. Which one are you leaning towards?
Here's what I tell people. If you ask me what my head says based on archaeology and historical sources, I think it's probably the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. We know that 100 years after the time of Jesus, Christians were going to that spot, and then Hadrian built a pagan temple over it. But we want to see a tomb, and we want to see a garden, and they've all disappeared, and that's why it leaves us emotionally unsatisfied. And so I tell people, my head tells me where it happened. My heart loves the garden tomb. And the garden tomb is the reminder that we don't worship the spot. We worship the Son of God who died and rose from the dead, who only inhabited that tomb for the 3 days. It's, in fact, I try and arrange a tour so that we visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and then the garden tomb on the same day, usually, if I can, the very last day, so that the final image they have in their mind is of an empty tomb and the reminder that because he lives, I can face tomorrow.
Yeah, I do love the garden tomb too, just for the experience, a very worshipful experience, and the lack of worshiping the stones, which really I have a problem with.
I agree completely.
And I think it really is applicable to all the other sites. We do not worship the stones, the tombs, the places, the soil. It's the spiritual experience that is unparalleled, that you do not get in any other place, no matter how historic. There are other countries that are filled with biblical history, but there is something about Israel that gives you the spiritual experience that you cannot get anywhere else. So let's talk about that. What do you think that is? What is it that we feel there? And many people, they become so attached, they make yearly or several times a year pilgrimages to the Holy Land. What is it that happens in our soul when we're there?
I think it's the connection to the book. We are people of the book. We love the Bible because the Bible tells us not only about Jesus as much as we love him, but all the other events God did in history. And that tiny piece of land is where God chose to demonstrate his power and his glory and his greatness in so many ways. And then we get to be there. And my favorite place is the Judean wilderness, which is virtually nothing. But yet I stand on the wilderness and I realize whether it was Israel in the wilderness or Jesus being tempted in the wilderness was always the place of testing and always the place where God showed he was sufficient. And I look at it and I can populate it with Abraham and David in that same area and Jesus. And when I come back and I read my Bible, I don't read about the wilderness the same way. I don't read Psalm 23 the same way anymore because that was written with the wilderness. I don't read Isaiah 40 the same way anymore because Isaiah wrote that talking about the wilderness between Jerusalem and Jericho. And suddenly this picture floods my mind. And I think not just mine, but everybody who's there, we now not only have a black and white image on a page, we have this stereoscopic view from our minds that takes that word of God and puts it in a new dimension for us. God's word was always alive, but suddenly it's alive in our minds in a new way because we can envision exactly what God said and what God did at that place and that time. That's what keeps me going back.
Yeah, I think you're right. It just makes the pages of the Bible come alive and therefore puts you in the better place to receive maybe what God is speaking to you. I'm trying to rationalize a spiritual experience, and this is a silly quest because you can't rationalize a spiritual experience, I suppose. So let's talk about Jerusalem and the prophecies, the end time prophecies. How in your mind does it all play out when you see, the whole Israel, the country of Israel is so small. It's tiny, and all the places that you imagine big and magnificent, they're all small. So how do you feel it's going to accommodate the prophecies, the end time prophecies?
Well, and I tell my students when I talk about it, because prophecy, people have different views. I say, take what I'm going to say with a grain of salt. You may need the whole salt shaker for this one, but we do know what some call the Battle of Armageddon actually is never a battle. In Revelation 16, it's a gathering. And when you stand at Megiddo and look at the Jezreel Valley, you say, well, if there's going to be a campaign, a final evil Antichrist campaign, that's a great place to bring in his forces. You've got Haifa on the west. You've got the International Highway to the north, to the east. He's going to gather there and begin a campaign. And then Daniel chapter 11 describes his final campaign. He enters the beautiful land. And then it says he heads down to Africa. It mentions Egypt, and it mentions Libya, and it mentions Ethiopia. There's a campaign. The Antichrist is going to put down the last of his problems, and he heads to Africa. But then it says tidings of the east and north disturb him. Well, Daniel always gives directions from the perspective of the Holy Land. So east and north, well, now I'm in Syria or Iraq or somewhere in that area. Something happens. The Antichrist goes that direction. And then he comes back and it says he pitches his tent between the seas and the beautiful holy at the beautiful holy mountain. The Antichrist's ultimate objective is Jerusalem. And it's interesting whether it's the prophet Zechariah, when the enemy comes, they're attacking Jerusalem when Jesus comes and his feet stand on the Mount of Olives. And I think Revelation 19, the return of Jesus, is to Jerusalem. I think he's going to stand on the Mount of Olives, and it's going to look as if the Antichrist has victory in his grasp. He's almost totally destroying the nation Israel. When Jesus comes, the Mount of Olives is going to split in two. I love standing there, by the way, and telling people, you need to look at it now because you're going to have a before and after, because there's going to be two mountains later. But Jesus comes, he rescues the people who are trapped in Jerusalem, destroys the Antichrist, and then comes to set up his kingdom. So I really see it. In fact, I call it the campaign of Armageddon. There's a number of battles that take place in rapid succession there at the very end of this time leading up to Christ's coming. That's going to be a terrible time of devastation. And yet Jesus is going to come at the very end and take care of the problem and rescue his people.
What an incredible time this is going to be. But and you're right. It's important that we take in the sides of the way Jerusalem is now, because one day it's going to be completely different, and it will be no more the way we know it now. So I am all about the people. As much as I'm drawn to the sites and the history, people is, and it's the nature of my work, the missionary work, I'm drawn to the people. So what can you say about the people of Israel and some of the encounters that you have had?
Well, I'll give you two perspectives. I tell people there's a lot of ancient stones, but if they come away and they want to be transformed, they need to get to know the living stones. They are the people and that's what God cares for, are truly the people. So two perspectives. The one is, the best thing that people can do to blow their categories. They have a perception of what they think the Middle East is. Get to know some of the Jewish individuals on the tour, your guide. Get to know some of the people in the hotels. Spend time to know them. Just find out about their families, and you will come away with a different perspective on Middle East, both Jewish and Arab. I love it. For 25 years, I've had a Jewish guide, a silent guide who comes with us, who's a believer, and an Arab driver he blows all the categories. He's an Israeli citizen who happens to be an Arab, but he's not Muslim. He's Christian, but he's not just historic traditional Christian. He's a believer. And I tell him, you get to know those two, and you'll realize the only peace you get in the Middle East is when both the Jews and the Arabs come to know the peace that comes through Jesus Christ. And then on the other side, I say part of the fun of Israel is getting to know some of the characters that are there. On the Mount of Olives, I called him Donkey Man. This fellow with a big bushy mustache and dressed in traditional Arab garb and his donkey, he looks like he came right out of the casting from Walt Disney World. But he would meet the people, and he knew how to work the crowd, but they had an experience there that they never thought they'd have, getting to know that individual. I got to tell you one story. I was there with my co-host on our radio program trying to do some recording for a Christmas special. And we had a friend in Bethlehem, and he said he could arrange to have a shepherd meet us and with his flock. Well, he forgot. So when we got there, he made some calls. He said, okay, I got it arranged. we went out and met this shepherd with his sheep, and it was just a great experience. The sheep and the goats, and he's dressed in his traditional garb, and he can't really speak English, but we're just having a tremendous time both taking pictures and doing some recording. We get all done, and we're going over to shake his hand and thank him. And then I noticed underneath his traditional garb, he had a nice Oxford pinpoint shirt, button-down shirt on. And I thought, so is he really a shepherd, or did my friend say, hey, Joe, could you go out there and just get these sheep, and he'll never know the difference. But it was a great experience, and then also a little bit of humor attached to it at the end for us, because we never knew if he was a real shepherd or a fake shepherd. But I could imagine him going home.
You never found out? I was waiting for the resolution of that story.
No, I pictured him going home that night and saying to his wife, honey, you'll never guess what I did today.
Oh, I had a great experience. We were visiting Golan Heights, and while our team was, taking pictures, and I, as always, I'm drawn to people, and there was this elderly man selling fig jam. And so I just engaged in this long conversation with him and found out that he was a retired math teacher. And so now him and his wife have an orchard, and so they make jams, from the fruit, and they sell it. And so in the process, he taught me a really cool math trick that was really very innovative. And I took high math in college, so it was really brilliant, And so then at the end of the conversation, he said, you're welcome to come to my house anytime and stay. And you know how it is in the Middle East, a very hospitable culture. So I felt really obligated to buy his jam. It ended up the worst fig jam I've ever had in my life. But I had the best conversation ever. And
bad jam, but good conversation. That's great.
Bad jam, good conversation. And that's what I feel it's all about. We've had wonderful opportunities to share Jesus with the people in Israel. And while I can't say that they're widely open to the idea, many of them are, and they're willing to, at least willing to listen what you have to say. But I also noticed that there is a lot of misconceptions among the Israeli people about Christians. I'm sure you have heard that. And so I'm curious about your perspective. Our perspective comes from the pastor that we work there, and he's a convert from Orthodox Judaism to Christianity. So he's very, very passionate. But so I'm curious about your perspective. How do you overcome these misconceptions and create a line of free communication, especially if you want to share about Christ?
Well, and what I've seen, and again, it's bringing tours over. I tell people the best thing they can do is be friendly, honest, open with the individuals, and as opportunities come up, just share what you believe and ask their opinion because they're willing to discuss that. But I've seen a number of guides come to faith. And they came to faith not because of intellectual arguments that were given by these people, but because they saw something in the groups that they didn't see in necessarily other Americans that they spotted. There was a genuineness, there was a love, and there was a care and a concern that overcame their initial reluctance. And then they began exploring. And it's interesting then, and I think God often does this, once they've opened it up, then God provides a way for someone there who speaks their heart language, who can then share in a way that makes a difference. Both my guide and my driver came to faith that way. The driver, we prayed for him for years, and God brought a believing pastor to Nazareth, because that's where our driver is from, who could share the gospel in a way that helped him realize he needed to come to faith. But it was watching these groups for years that he saw something different that was missing in his life, even though he thought he was a Christian. And the same thing with the guide. She just saw Christianity's for you Gentiles, Judaism's for me. But she saw something in us that she didn't have. And when somebody finally shared that with her, she came to faith. In fact, she said she went to a congregation, somebody explained it, and they said, would you like to receive Jesus as your Savior? And she said, yes. She shocked them because she said it was the first time that they shared the gospel and had somebody say yes right away. But it was because they were prepared by listening to all of those believers who loved them into the kingdom. And that's the greatest thing someone can do there is have a good testimony.
Well, and this is the basic principle that works all over the world. You can't
That's right.
intellectually change someone's mind. It doesn't work that way. But being the heart, the hands, the feet of Jesus does.
That's right.
So, one last question I have to you as a scholar: what are your thoughts on why modern day Judaism has veered so far from the traditional Old Testament Judaism?
Well, I think two things, and one is that, and it was just before the time of Jesus, the rabbinic interpretation, the idea that in addition to the scriptures, you had the oral interpretation, and in many ways they negated what God had really said in His Word through the oral interpretation. In fact, Jesus condemned the religious leaders in His day for having done that. The second thing, though, I think is I think Christianity has been its own worst enemy in sharing with the Jewish people. And when the Jewish people think of Christians, they think of Hitler as a Christian. They think of what the Christians did in the Crusades. And we have a lot of negative stereotypes of what Christianity is because of what we did to the Jewish people. So I think that's why we have a lot to overcome. And we just need to pray that their blinders come off, but they can genuinely see that we're not out to get something. We're there because we want to give them something and share the love of God. And I'm excited to see that there aren't a lot yet, but there are Jews coming to faith. When I first went to Israel, they estimated there were about 500 believers in the whole land. Today, I hear numbers like 20,000 or so, which is not huge from America's perspective, but that's a huge increase. And I think God is at work. Yeah, God is at work there, bringing people to faith, and we need to pray for them.
So we're going to post a link to where people can purchase your book in our show notes. But let's talk about whom is this book is going to benefit. Is it for people who have never been to Israel? Perhaps it has some ideas for people who have but want to learn something new. Who are your readers?
This is the best part of the whole book. It's for people who've been to Israel and want to relive the experience. It's for those who are thinking of going sometime in the near future, and they want to make sure they get the most out of their trip so they can understand what they'll see at sites. But then the largest group, I think, are people who love Israel. They would love to go. They can't afford it. Physically, they're not unable to do it. And I wrote the book as the second best alternative. If they can't go to Israel, it's really written to be a tour to Israel in written form. So hopefully they can experience what so many of us who've been there experience each time we go.
Thank you so much for this conversation and wishing you a very Merry Christmas.
Thank you, Helen, and you as well.
Visiting Israel is an amazing, educational, and a powerful spiritual experience. And while nothing can replace personally experiencing the land of the Bible, Dr. Dyer's book might be a great way to prepare yourself for the future trip, or an alternative if travel is not an option for you right now. At World Missions Alliance, we believe that changed lives change lives. We have already planned our next trip to Israel for October 15th through the 25th, 2023. And though this team is almost full, there are just a few spots open. So I want to invite you to join us on this unforgettable journey. Our itinerary is very different from other Israel tours because our main emphasis is on the living stones, as Dr. Dyer called them. So you will get to spend most of the time in the Upper Galilee, where Jesus did most of his ministry, and the 2 final days in Jerusalem. If you want to reserve your spot or just let us know that you're interested in joining this trip, send us an email as soon as possible at rfwma@rfwma.org, just to let us know. This trip is filling up very quickly. In the meantime, I want to wish you a blessed and peaceful Christmas. My favorite verse is, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called the Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace." That is Isaiah 9:6. Thank you for listening. Until next time, I'm Helen Todd.
Limitless Spirit Podcast is produced by World Missions Alliance. We believe that changed lives change lives. If you want to see your life transformed by Christ's love, or if you want to help those who are hurting and hopeless and discover your greater purpose in serving Christ through short-term missionary work, check out our website, rfwma.org, and find out how to get involved.